Yeah, wonderful. There, we got it. And so all local governments across BC and community institutional purchasers are welcome to join the British Columbia Social Procurement Initiative. Some of the member benefits that members receive when you join is we have a whole member area that has best practice templates for having requests for proposals, for small spends, direct awards, and policy. Best example practices. We have templates and guides, and the idea is that we can share the work across the membership and learning so that not everybody's doing it on their own, but we have a collective shared best practice that's being developed with standardized templates and ways of doing things around procurement and social procurement that you can adapt to your community needs and goals. There's consultation and support direct from the BCSPI team to help apply and implement your strategies. And we provide training and education for our members, both broad training that anyone can join, as well as member-specific training for staff teams. There's a ton of webinars that have been done so far in the first 2 years, and you can access all of those in the library. And we have an online resource library that's bringing in as well what other jurisdictions are doing. And so there's lots of reports and resources that are available. We have a bi-monthly community of practice call for implementers to talk about what's working, where the challenges are, and how we can do more together. And it's an amazing resource for our community members. And then we'd also have supplier and vendor outreach tools to engage with suppliers, and impact measurement framework that's being developed that aligns across the whole membership, how your procurement dollars are helping achieve both your community benefits as well as the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So we currently have over 30 participating members. We just had this month Lukula join, as well as Pemberton. So welcome to those two community members. You can see the GRU started on Vancouver Island and the coast and is now expanding thanks to support from the BC government to be available to communities across BC. And then we had a conversation with our steering committee and we asked, like, how do we really land your potential for procurement to make a difference in the issues that you're facing at your community level? And we know that local governments are seeing the impacts of climate change, or seeing the impacts of social inequity, or seeing the impacts of many of the things that are happening at a big level are felt so much at that local level. And so when we said, like, what are the 5 biggest topics that you want to talk about, these came up at the top. And we did brainstorm first a list of 15 or so. So there could be another series that comes after this. But it started off with these topics, and this is the Purchasing Power Speaker Series. And so we've already talked about how to engage Indigenous businesses and support your local economy through procurement dollars. And those sessions have been recorded and are available to view. Today we're talking about food security. After Christmas, after the holiday break, we will talk about how to support diversity and inclusion through procurement. And then we'll talk about climate change. And then we'll do a wrap up of next steps and practical approaches to moving these things forward and to identify those next topics that would like to be discussed. So one thing that we do for all of these purchasing power sessions is that we bring together both the supplier and the procurement side. So we want to hear both sides of that ecosystem, because we know that when you buy stuff and when institutional purchasers purchase something, they need to have the response from community in order to make that successful. So we've brought together to be able to speak on both sides of that for each of the organizations, or each of the topics that we come to. So today I'm so excited to have Heather O'Hara, who's the Executive Director of BC Farmers Market. Heather joined the BC Association of Farmers Markets in August of 2016, and she brings over 15 years of experience in nonprofit and social enterprise leadership to her position. Although she's originally from Manitoba, where her family has deep farming roots, Heather has been here in BC since 2000. And I'll let Heather provide a bit more information about herself shortly. Jennifer Reynolds is the Associate Director of Nourish. And as Nourish, she is working to bring local, sustainable, and cultural food into more central role for health and healing in the healthcare sector. And she believes in aligning mission, mandate, and margin can transform systems, and that delicious food will drive innovation in healthy eating and sustainability. So really excited to have both of you here. I'm going to unshare so that we can move to our questions. Just in terms of the format for this session today, we're going to have a Q&A between myself and Heather and Jen for probably about 25 minutes to half an hour. Then we'll open it up for chat, and feel free to pop your questions into the chat as we go. And Emma will be putting in resources and great things into the chat as well. So watch the chat, and then we'll have an opportunity for people to both put their stuff in the chat, as well as if you have a question that you want to unmute and ask directly to Heather and Jen, then we can do that. And then we'll come back as a final takeaway before we head off. So it'll be a very quick hour. All right. So great. So Jen, let's start with you. Can you tell us a bit more about your background and about the work that Nourish does?
Sure. Thanks for inviting me. And I'm calling in from Montreal on the unceded territory of the Mohawk. And very similar to the BCSPI, we're a national initiative or working with a community of practice on the tools and the mindsets and the systems understanding to really unlock the power of food, specifically in healthcare. So we work with what we're calling the Anchor Cohort, which is 7 teams that are hospital and community collaborations that are exploring, deep, wicked problems like food insecurity. Food is this well-known but siloed issue related to the impact that it has on our healthcare system. So we're really interested in leveraging an anchor institution, the purchasing, the leadership, partnerships, land, all of the things that where food shows up in a hospital or a long-term care facility or community health center, all of the possibilities of connecting that food and leveraging it towards more health for people and planet. And we also are working on these action learning series, again, communities of practice around having more planetary menus and bringing more Indigenous foodways into our healthcare system. So that's in a nutshell, Nourish's mission and purpose.
Thanks, Jen. Okay, how about you, Heather? Same thing. Tell us a bit more about yourself and also about the BC Farmers Markets.
Sure. So I'm dialing in today from my home kitchen/office. On the traditional territories of the Tsawwassen and Musqueam people here in, also known as Ladner in Delta, BC. So BC Farmers Markets is a sector organization in British Columbia. We represent 145 plus member farmers markets who share a philosophy around Buy BC in terms of make, bake, grow, and the vendors that operate there. So whether that be primary producer, farmer, prepared foods, and ready-to-eat foods and artisanal goods. And our role is to strengthen and support the success of those markets across the province. And we are all over the province, Haida Gwaii through the Kootenays and everywhere in between, northern BC and to Vancouver Island, which many of you know. I also, prior to joining BC Farmers Markets, was the executive director of Potluck Cafe and Catering, which is a very well-known social enterprise, and have a lot to offer in terms of some of the insight there around social procurement, how that was done and supported in that social enterprise as well. So along the way.
And Kristi, I forgot to mention, you asked me about my background. So my background is, I just wanted to add in, because I have a real food systems background that has led me into this work with the healthcare sector. So I just wanted to add that in. So I'm so excited to be on this panel or having this conversation with Heather, because I love the power of markets and food to be bringing people and community together. So it's going to be really great today. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. And it's so we can see that we have Jen here who has bringing that institutional purchaser level and speaking from hospitals. And that's why for BCSPI, it's not just local governments, but it's also those institutional purchasers within communities that have the potential to have that community impact with their spend. So it was really great to have an institutional perspective come in today. And Heather, who just has the breadth of what's happening with food across BC. So I'm really excited about that today. Heather, we have had an incredible week here in our province, and it's really put a spotlight on how vulnerable supply chains can be and the impact on some of the basic necessities of life, including, and food has been at the top of that. I'm just wondering if you can talk about what is the state of local and BC food generally, like how does it look normally and currently? If you could just give us a bit of a landscape.
Yeah, so I mean, like I had mentioned earlier offline, COVID, I think for many people who were not, like there's a group of people who already understand the importance of local food. And I think what COVID did last year was open the eyes of other folks and segments of our society to that supply chain. What is a supply chain? What if our supply chain was disrupted with food supply in particular? And frankly, the necessity to think locally and buy locally, that was a really front and center thing that I think really emerged, especially in COVID. And now with the floods, and I would argue the ongoing supply chain concerns related to COVID that are happening globally, I think people who are really, really, really getting it more than they ever did before, if they didn't before. And those who are really invested really get it and are really, really now even more invested in this local food supply issue. So, I mean, that segment in the Fraser Valley for sure is so devastating with the dairy farms in particular. We have small scale farmers who sell at farmers markets who've also been affected. Some of our smaller markets have lost all their year because it all floated away because of where they live and where they stored that kind of stuff. So I would say, British Columbia, there's a lot of people who are really committed to local food. I'm not sure that's the same everywhere in Canada or elsewhere. I think there's pockets of that, but I certainly think that in BC, there's a lot more appreciation and a lot more put your money where your mouth is in terms of spending your money with local dollars. I don't know why that is, but I do think that is. And I think it's also a function of the fact we have smaller farms. We have smaller, more the ability to have direct sales and direct contact with the consumer because of the small scale farm model. We do have commodity agriculturalists, obviously large blueberry farmers and what have you, but we also have a lot of small farms by geography. And it lends itself to direct sales, whether it be farm gate, farmers markets, or more niche retail markets and distribution as well. So there you go.
That's great. And so just building on that, can you talk about what is food security and why it matters?
Sure. Fundamentally, there's a lot of people have a lot of different definitions. I think it really boils down to food access, and not just food access to any food. I think it's really important that it's about access to quality food, healthy food, nourishing food, food that's grown with respect for the planet and the people and planet who produce it, and the cultural appropriateness of food as well. So food access is a big one. I think the food is medicine, so that it's a preventative measure for health and mental health and what have you. But ultimately, does someone have access to adequate, culturally appropriate, healthy, and nutritious food?
Thank you.
Yes or no, or to what extent? Yeah.
I'd love to hear what your answer to that. What is food security and why does it matter?
Yeah, I think Heather encapsulated it all. It's really about people having access, and that access comes from having a food system that's focused on nourishing and thinking beyond just nutrients and calories. We have to have a more robust definition of that. How is the experience of labor that goes into producing our food? How is it distributed? How is it made available? What can it do around bringing people together? I think there's many definitions that kind of amplify out, just not from calories delivered on a plate. I think it's a much richer version that we need to hold as our vision, because I think if we get focused on the smaller pieces, we come up with different kinds of solutions. And I think this window that, the current, the flooding in BC and the pandemic has really, as you're saying, it's opened this window and eyes to people that it's hard to think about there not being an abundance when you can go into a grocery store, the average person, and see so much, but not thinking about often people who are working in grocery stores are facing food insecurity themselves. And there's a lot of really compelling data about who is experiencing food insecurity. And it's not, a very typical portrait. A lot of it is often people who are working one or two jobs, but facing a lot of other costs of living that make that food dollar not go far enough. So that's where we really need these community-based solutions, place-based solutions for food systems that are really understanding that and solving for those issues.
Great. Heather, can you talk about what practices on the ground support food security?
Sure. So, like again, with this latest flood disaster, that need for preservation and nurturing and supporting our food lands, the places where we grow food, is fundamental. So if we don't prioritize protecting our food and farmlands, then we have no local option and are forced to go elsewhere if there is an elsewhere. So not to be too doom and gloom, but if there's nothing locally nowhere to grow locally, then what do you do if that doesn't exist and you're stuck importing food or what have you? And I would argue also the people. I think especially in the last 5 years in this role, really understand the complexity of growing and being a farmer per se. You need to be a meteorologist, a veterinarian, a climatologist, a pest control expert, and a horticulturist, and everything else in between. And how society has not valued, and especially in modern society, has valued the knowledge and the experience and the wherewithal and the toughness required and the stress, frankly, to grow our food. So protecting the people who grow it and or prepare it and the lands on which they do it is fundamental to food security. No land, no food. No farmers, no food.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So Jen, let's talk about institutional purchasers. You work with hospitals and other institutional purchasers. I'm wondering if you can just talk a bit about what are some of the, I'm going to say, opportunities as well as challenges that you see in institutional purchasers that are beginning to think through how they connect to local food systems.
Well, I think a lot of it is, it's connected to shifting that mindset from the lowest cost, chasing the lowest cost, to what can be the biggest value, the best value. And a lot of things in our food system are externalized. They're not showing up in the price. So as Heather was mentioning, protecting farmland and having culturally appropriate food, having sustainable food, things that are thinking more long-term about what is actually generating costs. So from a healthcare system, we have a lot of pressures on our healthcare system from unhealthy diets across the population, from food insecurity, and from climate. And, often agriculture, I don't think gets counted enough in that climate picture, but it is a significant contribution to greenhouse gases. So I think the healthcare sector is starting to see what its footprint is and starting to think about how it can be sustainable for its own financial sustainability. How can we keep delivering high quality healthcare? It's going to be needing to think upstream about ecological and human health, and food security comes into that picture. So often, we're dealing with healthcare needs downstream instead of upstream. And I think a lot of people in the healthcare sector are starting to turn to that. And they're also looking at what is the food environment when you go inside a hospital, or what is served to patients and what is served to residents. It means a lot to patients and families and to staff. And often the model that we're forcing the decision and the delivery of those systems with the lowest cost, and with a little bit of investment and thinking through these leverage points of the purchasing and the menu and everybody involved in making that system come together. 20 to 30 years ago, hospitals used to have their own bakery and their own butchery, and they were, taking raw ingredients sourced locally and preparing, I think, probably more nutritious and palatable meals for patients. So we're really hoping to tap into not a nostalgic past, but a way forward that, our public, something that's very important to the Canadian public, its healthcare system, is really reflecting the highest vision of what food and health can mean, and creating a more healthy population overall. So those are some of the things.
Do you have an example, a specific example that sort of demonstrates sort of what one hospital has done or what one food system, healthcare system is doing to advance those ideals or those principles?
Sure. Well, in one of our first cohort, there was a really great initiative led at a children and maternity hospital here in Montreal, Saint-Justin, and they implemented a model called the room service model. So instead of the conventional way that often, if you know or have been or have a loved one in hospital, you just get your meals 3 times a day. You might get a diet order that restricts your salt, but you don't really have any choice. And this just turns that on the head and enables children, especially, pickier eaters, not feeling great. Their family wants them to have the foods they're interested. They could call up and order from room service from a menu and get it delivered in 20 minutes. And that enabled the food service team to pivot, adjust its menu. The cost savings they had were great because the food waste was reduced, and they were able to shift some of those dollars over to sourcing from local and sustainable producers. And they actually saw anecdotally children choosing a lot of the healthy options. So they didn't lead them to that. They let the children choose on their own, and they ended up picking the veggie sticks and the healthy pizza and different things like that, more than you would have thought if you let a child pick from a menu. What would they choose? They'll just choose the cake. And they did choose cake sometimes, but they also made healthier choices. And then that hospital also developed relationships with smaller producers to start with the anchor kind of purchasing power of that hospital. Beekeeper was able to sell into the hospital and then expand their market with other hospitals because they were able to then have access to the market and the distribution networks that they had. And they had a number of sort of products that were developed in that way. So group purchasing is really, healthcare buys food in large quantities, and often being able to make it down to the smaller size of one hospital with some discretionary early products is a really powerful way that we've seen kind of break down the system into manageable steps where you can start to see some traction and dollars in all the good things happen from that investment and connection between the hospital and the producers in the area. That also is good for patients. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I mean, as a obviously hospitals are huge food purchasers. We'd also say, like schools are food purchasers, right? Those kind of organizations that are really delivering food and having food aspect. But I also think that we've looked and mapped at some of our local governments, and there's actually quite a lot of food purchasing that happens in terms of caterings and meetings and events and so on. So I want to flip back to Heather, who has lots of experience around this kind of purchasing. And I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about what you see as being those opportunities with institutional purchasers from a supplier perspective.
Yeah, so I'm going to put my potluck catering hat on. That was social enterprise in the downtown side, still is. So that was probably a lot of people don't know, that was like $1.5 million per year catering operation. And the way we affected change was when a company or a government, we catered to lots of council meetings. We catered to provincial health Services Association meetings, all kinds of institutional folks who chose to buy their catering from potluck because they knew that it was going to be support impact. In other words, every dollar they spent was going to provide employment for people facing barriers in the downtown east side, and they'd get a great product as well. So there was a very conscious choice to buy our catering. And that small purchase, that small catering order, $200, $100, that at the end of the year aggregated meant $500,000 worth of income and wages for people who may have otherwise not have been employed. So when you think about the impacts in your decision and the mindfulness about purchasing and the power of purchasing, like whoever coined the phrase purchasing power had it right, because it is powerful. If you think about the impact you can make with the conscious choice to purchase a certain way over another way, and the downstream impact, it's pretty impressive, right? So that's sort of one thing is, what are your day-to-day choices in your department, in your organization, where and how you buy food for a meeting or what have you. The other one would be gift, boxes. Where are you buying, your gifts for people, for example, going away presents? Like, be conscious, right? It could be Walmart, or it could be your farmer's market, a vendor, and going and finding a person who could supply all those things locally, and how that impacts your local economy and your local producers. So that's a bit of that kind of smaller scale. Then in terms of the bigger institutional opportunities, certainly farmers markets, producers may or may not be the right fit for an institutional procurement, but they might be on select items. So Jen had talked about honey, for example. You know, it's not an or situation. It's not go big or go small. It's like, what's the and, right? What could you add, or instead of doing it one way, in a piecemeal way? You know, like there's a local producer who could provide you with X, Y, or Z. So until you ask the question, you don't know, but we can't assume that they can't. So just, you know, to open your mind and challenge your assumptions a little bit around where and how you've been doing things. Is there another way, you know, in addition to what you already do, to start to dabble and get into picking away at some of these more meaningful purchasing decisions that could affect your local producers?
And Heather, can you talk about what are some of the barriers that suppliers and producers face in selling to larger purchasers, and what's kind of the best approach to make stronger connections between the two?
So I think, you know, I empathize with a purchasing director or what have you. You know, there's so much pressure on costs and managing costs, particularly with the public purse. Okay, so that's a real thing to contend with. I think, you know, more and more over time, we've seen that organizations, including governments and institutions, want to be more in line with UN SD Sustainable Development Goals, right? They want to have that triple bottom line impact. So I would argue there's more receptivity to purchasing differently in order to advance those impacts in addition to a reasonable price, right? Not the bottom of the barrel, not the lowest price on the possible, but there's much more holistic view about making these decisions that I think are more supported today than they ever have been in the past. Number two would be bureaucratic barriers around food regulations and food safety. Depending on the buyer, I've heard of that a lot. Oh, it's not HACCP certified, but there's other interim kinds of measures like GAP certification. With certain things, there's, by definition, food safety is always happening with any kind of food that's produced responsibly. So that regulatory barrier sometimes becomes a crutch for people. And, you know, that particularly matters when it comes to culturally appropriate foods too. So when I think of Indigenous communities who've been, you know, preserving salmon on the banks of the river and dried with wind for centuries, you know, that regulatory environment precludes that kind of food from entering the supply chain because there's too much scrutiny around barriers, but it's absolutely food safe. It's been done for centuries. It's just not that Western, you know, commercial kitchen kind of mentality or the HACCP certified and all these kinds of regulations that I think often play out a lot with our decision making. And then obviously there's education with the procurement folks and the will. And I think the will comes with education and an invitation from decision makers to say, we want to do it differently. We want you to have a true cost accounting approach to your purchasing decisions. So that goes hand in hand. You know, there needs to be a will from all sides of the equation in terms of purchasing differently and purchasing for impact.
Can you quickly just say what you mean by true cost accounting?
Sure. So that would be things like not just the cost of the goods, but what, you know, if we chose to purchase that item from a local producer, what would that mean to the local economy as an impact or a positive investment, as opposed to buying it from something that maybe was imported from somewhere far away? Where and how does that impact the local economy or your neighbor or your preservation of your food lands and farmlands, for example? So thinking about the where does the money go is probably a nice, simple, maybe oversimplified way to think about it. But
thank you.
And
Jen,
environment too.
Yes, thanks. Jen, I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about who institutions buy from and how do they connect with suppliers? Like when they're going out and beginning to make that shift into food secure purchasers and suppliers and producers and trying to connect this in, what's their steps that they can take to make those connections and move that forward?
Well, I think, healthcare is unique in that it does really typically uses a group purchasing model and is actually quite constrained by that. I think it can be a jujitsu used strategically, but so there's often a committed buy that's made to a group purchasing organization, but food sometimes falls outside of that, and particularly fresh food. So I similarly, I think, some of the institutions or partners on the call have this similar flexibility where some of the things are available so fresh produce, fluid milk, these sort of things are typically bought regionally. And there's opportunities for buying them because they're not part of the committed buy. And I think also a lot of time hospitals will start with a specific product and something that is where they can make a substitution for something they already buy. So an example of a Vermont Medical Center, which is now one of the leading hospitals in the US for local and sustainable purchasing, they started by buying from a local bakery. So they also looked at the quality and definition of local for them, which was related to how the food was produced. I don't know, maybe now the grain is being produced also in Vermont, but probably not. So they were also flexible about determining like some aspect of what is considered local and sustainable, because it's often so complicated. Just starting somewhere is actually a powerful way to get forward. It sounds cliche, but it actually is where many people get started, because you need to build this muscle. We need to learn and build the tools. And I think that your initiative and by social is part of what we need to expand with the field. So there's a lot of procurement mechanisms and practices that we need to work through and find out ways that we can better put these values, as Heather was just mentioning, the things that aren't accounted for, how do we start to put them into the contracts that we make and establish? And food service management companies' contracts are also very powerful and often underutilized, where we can start to leverage that as part of what is expected from the contractual relationship from the buyer and the service provider.
Yeah, and thank you. And we're talking, that's the big shift around social procurement is instead of lowest price or greatest value, and you're reinforcing that. And I just want to land a little bit on price because, that is a huge shift to create an institutional purchaser culture and systems to be able to equally and proportionately include social, environmental impacts and opportunities within that purchasing, framework. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the fears around potentially higher cost, and particularly you mentioned earlier a Quebec policy around that. I'm wondering if you could share a bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. So the Quebec's legislation within its sustainable development kind of impact that it wants to achieve have a preferential margin that public purchasers can use. So it's up to 10%. So that would be a differential. The price is paid for the more environmental sustainable product, but the bid is evaluated with a 10% reduction so that they're more comparable in terms of price. So that's one, example that I think is quite interesting. In the institutional setting of hospitals, the menu is also very powerful. A lot of these changes can be made to be cost neutral by adjusting what is served. And that sort of the less meat, better meat is an example of a blended burger. So having beef with mushrooms included means you can buy a higher quality beef. Also, adding to the nutritional profile of that and come out at the same cost point. So those are two examples. And there's a third one that I think I shared the case study link, and we can share that, related to changing the evaluation criteria in procurement. Was the project led or an initiative led around some sustainable beef that healthcare was interested in purchasing, and the failed bid of the supplier, when they went back in to look into how their bid was evaluated, they realized that the supplier was valuing their product based on the protein and the cost per gram, but the hospitals and the contracting process was looking at it by the portion cost per gram. And when they went back and evaluated on the nutrition profile, the local product, sustainable product, actually fared better. So they realized that they could look within the mechanism of what they're evaluating, really getting precise and technical about what is the thing you're assessing. And if you look at nutrition, that can be one, I think, again, underutilized criteria that we're not using, that often local and sustainable food actually outperforms food from the more global food system.
Thanks. Heather, do you want to add anything into this specific topic?
Yeah, sure. I think, one of the dilemmas with a small scale producer, farmer, so to speak, is margins, right? So a lot of times, a lot of folks don't want to sell into those kind of wholesale models because their margins are eroded greatly. And the people that make the most money are the wholesalers, the food distribution companies. However, there are a lot of producers who are quite open to selling to an institutional purchaser if the price is reasonable. It may not be as cheap as what you could get at Cisco, okay, but it might have all these other downstream impacts that we've just talked about: preservation of food lands, local economy, environmental footprint, etc. So I think we need to keep an open mind. That is possible, and it does happen. And a lot of producers also are interested in forward purchasing. So if an institution says, you know what, we need blueberries, okay, or we need or want X, Y, and Z, zucchini, working with your local farmer to actually forward grow with an idea that would be sold, all of it, to a purchaser. So it's a guaranteed sale. They know what they're growing and why. That can be a real bonus for everybody and a real benefit for the producer as well. If they have the certainty, it's kind of like a CSA on steroids, an institutional CSA, if you will, which can be kind of cool. I never thought of that till now, that term. And then I think we're going to talk about seasonality in a little bit, but I think it's important people challenge their assumptions about, is our menu in season? Like, seriously, are we doing this because we've always done this, or what can be tweaked? Are we buying stuff that's appropriate for the season in British Columbia? Okay. And thinking about preservation of food too. Fresh blueberries become frozen blueberries, right? Fresh blueberries become dried blueberries. So it may be that the bounty happens at a particular time of year, but there's an opportunity to freeze these things and preserve them for later use in the winter as well. And that's like squash and everything else too, right? So let's challenge our assumptions, and even with the cultural appropriateness of food, I talked about Indigenous foods. That would also translate to other cultural communities too. Are the foods we're on our menu representative of the diversity of people who are eating them? And we can't underestimate the psychological impact of food on people's well-being. When we did that smoked, like, windsock salmon for the Downtown Eastside Women's Memorial March meal every year when I was at Potluck, you would not believe the gratitude people felt because of the relatability and the power of how much that resonated and how much a mental positive impact that made. I would argue that would be the same with any foods that are relatable and recognizable. And we've seen that in action, right? As well. So there you go.
Thanks. And we have heard from, I would say over here with the local food producers have talked about the potential for institutional purchasers to give in advance, like to say, this is what we're going to buy this year, and to put that up and be transparent about it. And then that allows the local food systems to not only, plan and look ahead, but also to collaborate with others in order to meet volume needs. I'm wondering, Heather, if you could just quickly touch on, maybe give 2 points of what support do local farmers and food producers need in order to access institutional opportunities?
I think outreach, engage with, go to your local farmers market, have the conversation, right? Until you don't know. And honestly, don't just, if it doesn't work for somebody, it might work for somebody else, So, I go back to the will a lot. The will matters with everything. Like, if you have, where there's a will, there's a way. All these cliches came up for a reason because it's true, right? If you want it, do it some way, you will find a way. And I think the farmer and the producers will find a way, because they also care about their neighbors. So not only, the shopper out there, but the person who's going to be affected and positively impacted by their feeding people in their community. That's a huge driver for a lot of producers. They want to do that. So that would be one thing. Engage, go talk to. And if you want to find a farmer's market as a way to maybe get in, and maybe they can direct you to other farmers if they're not at the farmers market, which is the bcfarmersmarkettrail.com. It's a good way to find a market and start that conversation. And then the other one would be that seasonality menus. Like, I think really challenge your assumptions around, like, is this menu working for local producers? And what could we tweak? Even if it's 1 or 2, 3 things, it doesn't have to be a big overhaul, but what are those 1 or 2 meaningful institutional procurement, numbers, or a subset of those where we could get food from multiple sources? Like, in other words, we're going to get some from here, we're going to get some from here, because we know that some from here is going to make a difference in one or two areas. Yeah.
So I'm going to open up to some of the questions that we're getting in on the chat. I'm going to let Jen do this first one from Kayla. And I think it's a really interesting question, is she's asking, should we be focusing our efforts on transforming already big suppliers to have them be able to adopt more sustainable food practices and try to do that? Or do we want to focus on uplifting and growing and collaboration between smaller social enterprises and food producers? And I'm just wondering your thoughts on that, Jen.
That's a great question.
Maybe it's a yes and.
I think it's a yes and. I think it happens all the time, because I think, it comes up as a real debate, and depends where you are on the which part of the system you want to move the fastest. But I guess I feel like it's a yes and, because we need to help all parts of the sector, of the agricultural sector, transition to more sustainability. So it's going to need the full court press, I think, within the climate window that we have. And I guess, I do, for the multiplier and the impact, I do very interested in the opportunities when we unbundle and we think outside of the box and think at different scales. I think that does really bring more things into the mix. So I do think they need different kinds of investments and different strategies. I think part of what a large lentil producer in Saskatchewan is focused on a global market, and there aren't enough people in that province to eat the food that is being produced. But it doesn't mean that they are not interested and passionate. As a personal family farmer or producer, they want to be able to connect and help to feed their community. So I think there's a lot, as Heather was getting into the values, that people share. Tapping into that is an important part of doing both of these kinds of development, of getting the larger food system to be more sustainable and open up some of the flexibility in its systems to better suit and support more local and resilient systems. So with the bigger suppliers, they have unprecedented demand for local, but they have a lot of challenge in their system, that they don't have the traceability, they don't have the ordering system, they don't have the inventory system. So we can, I think, be making some partnerships and opportunities happen that don't create the one or the other. Sorry, I feel like it's skating around. It seems like a really political answer, but that is sort of where I do sit and see the complexity, because we can't transition fully to the small local sustainable system because the food supply is not there. We need to be building it up as we get to that future where they're more balanced. I think, so the Arrow Food Institute recently, I don't know if Evan Fraser had a piece that was related to the food security issues or supply issues from the flooding, and, identified fruit and vegetable self-resiliency. That's something that really does suit small scale agriculture in a lot of contexts and places. So there could be some product categories that we could focus on first that could help to enable this kind of shift to happen.
Thank you. So Leanne wants to have it be very clearly outlined, the connection between procurement and food security. And we talked a little bit about there's different choices that purchasers can make. So we have you can choose who you get your catering from, and if they're social enterprises and they impact on employment, and different local owners who do that. We talked about looking at land and how land can be zoned and how it can be also then purchased from by institutional purchasers from local producers that then build up your farm and local farm food security system and your farmers markets and producers. So you begin to pay your attention and put your dollars towards organizations, businesses, farmers, actors that are building regenerative food systems. I'm wondering, Heather, if you want to just bring that home and make any connections that might still need to be made.
Yeah, I think, one of the advantages purchasing folks have is they're very numbers oriented. And I don't want to generalize, Kay, because I don't know everybody on the call. But I think you have the advantage of being numbers oriented, which it can be a plus and a negative, like anything, right? But if you put on your number crunching hat, just to build on what Kristi said, you know, put yourself in the shoes of the producer. So let's just pick on the potluck catering model, right? So every sandwich, you know, that $10 crispy chicken wrap has, you know, sort of 3 core components: a food cost, a labor cost to make it, and like overhead, you know, paying for the rent to keep the kitchen going and all this kind of stuff. So if you just literally take that $10 wrap and slice and dice it according to typical food costs is 20 to 30%. So where do you want the 20-30% to be spent? On a local food input ingredient, if you will, or not? Okay, so that has impact about where those dollars go. The employment piece. So in our case, it was social enterprise. We wanted more people working. We wanted higher wages and higher sort of probably less efficient labor because it meant it was actually a good thing, right? We had 50% labor costs. So that 50% of that $10, $5 goes to pay a wage, a portion of that wage or wages on that team to make that crispy chicken wrap. So again, I want that wage to affect that community and my neighborhood, as opposed to some anonymous person who may or may not be in my local economy at all, or my province or my country even. And that's not to poo-poo those places, but to say, where do you want to keep your dollars? So if you slice and dice the dollars you've purchased and where that money is going, follow the money. It can be quite enlightening, I think, to see. You can assess yourself. Is that the impact I want to leave or not, right? Is that how and where that I want those dollars to go or not? I think it's very helpful to sort of dissect it in a very accounting way. That's kind of how it works. Hopefully that's helpful.
And maybe I can add in, and specifically, I mean, Nourish has this frame of working with the healthcare sector as well. But I think it is another, if you define food security as the access piece, investing in upstream health, we keep using that as a jargony term, but if food insecurity is a driver of the use of the healthcare system, it is a small investment in, if we invert that, instead of dealing with, paying for hospital beds, there's lots of innovative models where it's more explicit in the United States, where the health insurer sees the opportunity to be investing in supporting healthier diets and access, because then there are healthier people in communities who use the healthcare system less. So I think when we have to, it's maybe with the group as you are purchasers, there's a dimension for you around the providing access, and your purchasing dollars help to create those producer networks, distribution channels that enable more local food to flourish and the economic multipliers to multiply. So this is where it's part of what is going to help to diversify the marketplace for producers, that in turn, but you need to see it at quite a high level to see where food and health and economy end up intersecting. And it's hard to, it isn't literally, a food banking kind of solution that we're trying to put forward here. I think about how we need to get into the deep roots of the system to really address food insecurity. But it's all adding up to something that ends up being quite powerful.
Yeah. I wanted to share an example from our region. So North Saanich is a municipality in just a little bit north of Victoria here. And they had a racetrack that had existed for quite a long time on the peninsula. And when it, had been sat fallow for a long time, and they wanted to figure out, well, what can we do with this land that was, a community asset, but to have it go and meet some of our community needs. And they identified, trying to figure out how they could support farmers and sustainable food production with that asset. So they put out a request for proposals to have different ideas come forward around what could happen with this land, this 83 acres of racetrack land. And they accepted a bunch of proposals. They had presentations, they went through the process, and they ended up awarding the land to the Circular Farm and Food Society, so a nonprofit organization, and what they're doing with it is they're creating and dividing up the land to not only create examples of forward-thinking farming, to provide opportunities for young farmers to gain the skills and to learn how to be farmers, to actually give them access to land to start growing. So sort of like a pop-up shop for farmers where they can actually learn their skills and start to grow and have that be, and then they can begin to sell and change the food system. They've woven in agritourism and a whole bunch of things that have begun to build and support the food security in North Saanich by taking that kind of look and providing opportunities. And we know that access to land is a huge cost for farmers. So by being able to take some of that cost from young farmers and allow them the opportunity to do their farming and to gain the skills and to get a runway to be able to then move to their own farms is a huge piece of building up that food security system. So I think there's different ways that we can see local governments, municipalities, and regions beginning to tackle and connect their land, their purchasing, their support to be able to build and enhance food security. So in our final few minutes here, I'm wondering if you can talk about two things. Like, what do you see as the connection between food security and social benefit? What would you say, Jen? You're the first answer to that.
Well, I think I was just trying to get at it in the last comments I was sharing. Yeah. I mean, I think it's having a healthy community and investing in food security, and so that everyone in our communities is well fed and nourished is really important for our social well-being. And holding food brings a stronger social fabric together. So I feel like thinking about how we as a society, what we decide to do with we're in charge of our institutions, right? They are there to make our society better. So I feel like making a connection to some of these other goals, other than in addition to containing costs and being efficient, but also having dreams of these healthier communities and a healthier planet. I think we can layer all of those things in together. And that's kind of how the flourishing, when we don't stay constrained by the way we currently do it and think of a new way that we could do it, I think that's the impact that we could have.
Thank you. How about you, Heather?
Yeah, sure. I think, that word was escaping me until Jen mentioned it a minute ago, that multiplier effect. Like, I think somebody shared the economic benefit study from the BCFM did on the impact of farmers markets generating revenue, like direct revenue. That's money in the pockets of farmers and producers and food folks, and the small businesses, like 4,000 plus small businesses, including farm businesses, obviously. So the indirect effects, like they're then going out and buying seeds, and then they're going to restaurants to have a night out on the town and eat some fantastic food and shop and buy their own things and needs for their families, pay taxes, all the kinds of things that keep a community going. So that multiplier effect, I think, is really important. I think that consciousness as a purchasing person to just go, I want to have the biggest multiplier effect. So how do I do that? What are the choices I would make to have the biggest multiplier effect? Climate, people, my neighborhood, the institution itself, obviously, that you're purchasing for. And how do we incentivize that, right? How do we get rewarded for that? How do we advance getting rewarded for that kind of approach, as opposed to, and I'm not suggesting it is this way, but the cheapest is better. The more money saved is the incentive. So I think there's much more progressiveness around this, because it's much more mainstream to be thinking about all these multiplier impacts now than ever before. Like even my potluck days, like 20 years ago, that was way harder to convince people than it is now. It's almost, it kind of goes with the territory now. Like, okay, how is this good for the planet? Like, how is this good for people, right? Much more prevalent now, thankfully.
Thank you. And Heather, we'll just stay with you. What's one concrete action that people can do on the call today to move forward their procurement and connect it better to food security?
I kind of like that seasonality issue. Like, challenge yourself and go, could our menus be tweaked? And Jen made a good observation too. Like, okay, burgers, like maybe it's some meat and like plant protein, right? And all these kinds of things, like engage some of your foodie chef types in this world. Even if you're not have chefs in your institution, like those folks can make a magic out of anything, frankly. And with given a, limited barrier or some parameters, like in other words, seasonal foods from British Columbia, summer and what can be preserved, I think you can come up with some really interesting things, and shift what you do and how you do it for the better, as a stepping stone to actually changing what you do.
Thank you. And how about you, Jen? What's one concrete action that you would recommend?
Well, I think we've, distilled between Heather and I, like scanning and seeing who the suppliers are in your community and forge a relationship with them and trial their product, see if there's a way to bring it into your facility or menu. We haven't really talked about it, but probably all your places of work or your locations are places that can become food access points, can be places for a community to come together. I don't know, a CSA drop-off, meal program or anything like that. So you could start with featuring the producers in your area, exposing your staff and your community to who they are. So I think these are all things that are your next lunch and learn or other showcase community day could be focused on food. So that could be one place to start.
I like what you said, Jen, because it humanizes this process. And I think just to add to that, that engagement thing I mentioned around go talk to farmers, just go make a call, right? And humanize the relationship, because I think one of the challenges, and probably it's a bureaucratic requirement, is like this sort of RFP, everything's formalized in RFP kinds of procedures, but does it have to be? Does it have to be? Even just gathering information could be much more, I think, more humanized and more relationship based, not just, did you see BC bid? Okay, and then if you're not monitoring BC bid, you don't really care what's on BC bid.
Well, thank you both so much. I'm going to pass over to Emma, who's going to talk about our next in the series.
Thanks, Kristi. Yeah, so coming up, we're taking a little break for winter season, holidays, and so on. We'll be coming back in January to talk about how social procurement can support diversity and inclusion, which is also a very ongoing, important, timely subject. And we'll be hearing from Narissa Allen, who's the co-founder and president of the Black Business Association of BC, who can speak to both the supply and demand side of involving procurement for including diverse-owned businesses. And then Dugan Selkirk, who's gonna speak about his work with Community Futures BC, where he's a business advisor for entrepreneurs with disabilities, and talking about how procurement with those kinds of entrepreneurs and business owners can make a really big impact in local communities. So really looking forward to that. I'll share the link to register now in the chat, and we'd love to see you all there. And thanks for everyone's attention today.
Thank you. We'll follow up and send out the recording. We'll send out all the resources that you saw in the chat and anything else. And a huge thank you to Heather and to Jen for taking their time and sharing their incredibly depth of wisdom and experience with us today. Yeah. Enjoy.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you.